All right, three, two, one. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. We talked 2 months ago about his book, which was titled The Falsification of History, Our Distorted Reality. And that's a great book. I highly recommend that book. But he has just published a new book, a book that came out this month, May 2nd, 2019, the title of which is JFK, A Very British Coup. The Definitive Truth of the Assassination. And his name is John Hamer. John, are you there?
I am, William. How
Awesome.
are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for agreeing to the interview. I really read through the book and found it very interesting. A lot of information I did not know. And, I think you wrote on the intro, there's like 40,000 JFK books on the assassination. So this is, for me, a welcome addition to see the broader realities or broader involvement of people outside of the U.S. who definitely seem to be involved in this death of JFK, John F. Kennedy, on November 2nd, 1963. So maybe before we get into the text of the book, you can talk a little bit about your background and how you became interested in this subject, and then we can talk about some of the forces that really conspired to kill John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, as people have already heard me speak will know, I've been into the sort of, for want of a better word, the conspiracy world for over 20 years now, and I've investigated full time during that time many, many different topics, and JFK was just one of them. A lot of the stuff, other stuff, the great grand conspiracy is covered in, as you just kindly pointed out, The Falsification of History, which is another of my books. But yeah, the JFK thing, I've always been fascinated in it. I think most people have, even it's not just an exclusively an American thing. I think the whole world was absolutely fascinated by the Kennedy assassination and the mechanics of it and who was involved. And of course, I don't think that many people actually believe that Oswald was the lone gunman at all. And so in one sense, we've got a head start there when we're trying to convert people to, or trying to convince people that there was a bigger conspiracy, because I think most people realise that all the stuff from the Warren Commission, which allegedly investigated the Kennedy assassination, is known broadly to be a nonsense, really.
Right.
So yeah, I've always been interested in it, and it just. What triggered the book actually was that I'd actually written for one of my other books, Behind the Curtain. I'd written a huge section on Kennedy, of which a lot of that was in this book. Excuse me. And quite simply, there wasn't enough room for it to go in Behind the Curtain because it's a massive book. It's over 500,000 words, but I actually wrote over 900,000 words, but it just it's in 2 volumes as it is, and I just thought, you've got to be sensible about this and cut it down. And a lot of the stuff that I cut out was the stuff about the Kennedy assassination. So it's sort of been simmering in the back of my mind for quite a while that, maybe I could make a book of it. And that's exactly what I did in the end. So I just expanded upon it, and there you have it.
Gotcha. And your general position, you kind of go back and trace the history of these nefarious groups that really have been in the Western world, but who definitely were traced to many of these key players around the conspiracy to kill JFK.
Yeah, absolutely. I was speaking to a JFK assassination expert just this week, as a matter of fact, and he's a American guy who's been researching it for over 30 years, and he read the synopsis of my book, and he just said, wow, didn't know any of that stuff at all. And we just had a very brief conversation through Twitter messaging, actually. And so this is a guy who's been looking into the stuff for 30 years. So there is a lot of other background that people are not aware of. And what I've done is, as you sort of alluded to there, is I've expanded the search, if you like. So I've gone out beyond the borders of the US, and the footprints lead directly to the UK. And the British Crown. Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe you can talk about that, the British Crown and the
Sure.
City of London and all of these people who are interested in the banking cartel.
Absolutely. Yeah, okay, I think you're right. I think that's the best place to start is the actual background to it. what a lot of people don't realise, that there is an entity called the Crown Empire, or the Crown, it's sometimes called for short. And the Crown doesn't necessarily mean the Queen of England or the British monarchy, although they are obviously the figureheads of it. But it goes much, much deeper than that. The Crown Empire actually controls world politics. It controls world, I mean world, not just British, banking, the health system, everything. Huge corporations are all directly or indirectly controlled by some aspect of the British Crown Empire. It's an all-powerful entity, in other words. And as I say, it's not exclusively British either. I mean, America is intrinsically involved with it too. Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, just to give you a little bit of background to how it sort of started, it began at the end of the 17th century with the formation of the Bank of England. I don't want to go into too much detail and bore everybody to death, but I think it's important to get this background. The Bank of England was created in 1694, and it was financed by Dutch bankers who usurped the British throne and placed William III on the throne. Again, I don't want to go too deeply into that. But anyway, it was the Bank of England, the formation of the Bank of England, that led to the beginning of the central banking system, if you like. And this actually, their ability to create money from thin air gave them the power and the finance, obviously, to expand their sphere of control. And what happened was that the actual city of London, and by the city, I don't mean London itself, Greater London, I mean the actual financial heart of the city, and it's just referred to in the UK as the city, and it's the financial empire. And it's 1 square mile, and it's just slightly to the east of the city centre proper. And that city, that square mile, actually became a sovereign state in 1694 when the Bank of England was founded. And that's important, that it was a sovereign state in its own right. Very much the same as Washington, D.C.
Or the Vatican, right, the Vatican, yes.
Yes, there are the three. The City of London is the world banking empire, the Washington, D.C. is the military empire, and the Vatican is the religious empire. And they're all connected, and they're all governed either directly or indirectly by the British Crown. So this square mile of the city is not subject to UK law in any way, shape or form. It's got its own courts, it's got its own flag, it's got its own police force and mayor, and world Freemasonry is also run from there, as well as the entire world legal apparatus, believe it or not. I know some of this information might sound absolutely fantastic to people, but trust me, it's true, and it's quite easy to Google this stuff and find it out for yourselves. I'm not making this up.
No, but when I was in the UK and traveled to the City of London, it's discernibly different than the other parts of the city. It actually really has a completely different architecture, and its streets are a little different. It's pretty remarkable. And I was in the banking industry, and nobody could really figure out why the London Interbank offering rate was a key lending opportunity, why we were going all the way to London, but it really was. That's actually a global standard, comes out of the Bank of London. I mean, the City of London.
Absolutely. And in fact, many even US banks have their headquarters in the City of London, which I found absolutely amazing, to be honest. You know, the fact that you think it's Wall Street, don't you, the US empire, the US financial empire, but no, a lot of American banks' headquarters, I think there's about 70 who have their headquarters actually in the City of London. And there's something like 400 major world banks that have their headquarters in the City of London. So that just speaks volumes to me. Wow. Okay. So yeah, Freemasonry is there. The legal system is there. It doesn't operate under common law either, which is an important point. Common law is the law of the land. It should be the law of the land in every country, but it's not. Common law is very simple. Common law just states that you shouldn't do harm to anyone in any way, shape or form, or permit harm to be caused to another by your inaction. And that's common law. Yeah, but the laws that govern us are so vast now that they're not actually laws. They're called statutes, really. And it's commercial law, maritime law, or the law of contracts. And that's how they assert the control over us, by usurping common law and creating this set of rules for themselves that allows them to in effect, bend the legal system to what they want it to be. And this has been noted. Many people might have noticed this. For example, when you see courtroom dramas in both the US and the UK, the Union flag in the UK has a gold fringe, and the Stars and Stripes in the US in courtrooms has a gold fringe as well, as it does on military uniforms as well. And then it's that denotes that you're actually operating under maritime law, the law of contracts, and not the law of the land, which is common law. If we were to just operate under common law, then they couldn't control us in the way that we do. And so this is why they do it, and it's all very, very fake and all very contrived. Okay.
And
so,
I mean, that's the kind of background of these connections through this kind of do permeate these players in the Kennedy killing, and all the way even to the U.S. So you can see this kind of banking hand behind everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, the Crown's not subject to the UK government, and I think we're sort of getting to the point a little bit now. I know it's been a little bit of a digression, but another key element to what we're talking about is the fact that the Crown Empire still, and this is a very important point, holds the lands and title deeds to all of North America, not just Canada, but the US as well. A lot of people don't believe that. Oh no, we won our independence in 1776, the War of Independence, blah blah blah. I'm sorry, yes, that was the appearance, but in actual fact, that wasn't the case. And again, I would invite anybody to just do a very quick internet search on that topic, and you'll see that it's true. George III, when he allegedly reluctantly gave the US its independence after losing the war, losing in quote marks, he insisted on retaining ultimate control, and this has remained the case ever since. America is not an independent state, despite all appearances to the contrary. But as agreed in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the US was to remain a crown colony, and it has done to this day. And in fact, it's operating under a fake constitution as well now. The original constitution was quietly scrapped in 1871 and replaced by an entirely different one. Completely different set of rules. And in order for them to achieve this was how the District of Columbia had to be instituted, and that also became a city-state at that point in time. Okay, and again, as I say, don't take my word for it. This information is all quite easily accessible. So it's not like, John Hamer's talking a load of rubbish. It's easily verifiable, all this stuff. So, that just sets the scene. So we've got this powerful entity called the Crown, who control everything. They control the finance, they control all industry and commerce, they control the legal profession, they control just about every major institution you can imagine in the Western world, at least, and certainly a lot as well in the East. So you've got this guy, Kennedy, who I believe was he was no angel. I don't think anybody who gets to the top of politics is going to fall into that category. But I think he was basically a decent guy who wanted to do the best for his people within the constraints that he would have as a president. And but unfortunately, there were certain things that happened or that he instigated within his presidency that caused all these different forces of the Crown Empire to come together to conspire against him.
But Kennedy himself, JFK was no choir boy. He wasn't from a very honest or, the Joe Kennedy himself was, and you write in the book, somebody said about Joe Kennedy was the personification of evil. And he was
Absolutely.
like a great financial grave dancer, inside trader, friend of the Bronfman family, which is still relevant today in regards to this Nexium cult. Yeah, so really remarkable stuff.
Yeah. I mean, Joe Kennedy was quite an operator. Yeah, I mean, he had his fingers in many pies, as they say. He was involved in the early days of the movie industry. He was, as you say, he was involved in the liquor industry, especially during Prohibition. He was the prime mover in getting a lot of the whiskey and liquor from Bronfman's in Canada, as you mentioned, into the US, and of course he made a huge fortune on the back of all that, and he was heavily involved with the mafia as well. And again, they do rear the head in my little book, the mafia,
Right,
as
sure.
they're one of the factions that are involved. People think that they're just sort of all right, they're quite prominent and they're dangerous and important and all the rest of it, but they don't think they've got any real power governmentally. Well, I'm sorry again to disabuse people of that, but they certainly have.
Oh, no
the
doubt.
mafia is a very key player.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, they had control over J. Edgar Hoover. They actually had him blackmailed. So he actually never said there was any such thing as the mafia.
Yeah, that's right. He was in their pocket without a doubt. Yeah.
And but Joe Kennedy, he was kind of like something that happened here in 28, where he came in and took all these defaulted mortgages and bought them cheap and resold them when the market corrected. Like, he knew all this stuff, and these types of techniques and tactics go back through Joe Kennedy, even before him, but all the way up to current day. I mean, you have the head of the Treasury here in the United States. It's Mnuchin, who did the same thing that Kennedy did. That's how he made his money. He bought these portfolios of defaulted mortgages. But it's incredible too that Joe Kennedy became the head of the SEC in 1934. Is just astonishing.
It's as I say in the book, it's like the fox in charge of the hen house, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that it's interesting that family dynamic and dynastic elements of the Kennedy family really changed after Kennedy Sr. had a stroke on 19th of December 1961. I think you pointed that out, and I think it's an important point that it changed John and probably Robert as well into more independent players. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, I would. Yeah, I mean, Joe was an arch manipulator. Just to go backtrack slightly, I mean, it was he that had massive ambitions for his sons. He put them under a lot of pressure. It was his machinations, if you like, that sort of manipulated one of his sons. Unfortunately, until Joe Jr., John's older brother, died in the war, it was Joe that was going to be, put forward as president and all the rest of it. But because unfortunately Joe Jr. was killed in the war, it fell upon John. And John was quite a sickly sort of a child and a young man. He was actually a lot more sickly than people imagined him to be. But he was nevertheless, I think a lot of it was sort of out of his control. As I say, Joe Senior was an arch manipulator, and he maneuvered John into that position with the help of people like the mafia and Aristotle Onassis was another big player in it all, of course. And it was on the mafia and Onassis' say-so that John was actually manipulated into the role of president, to replace his elder brother.
Right, and it was kind of like there was all kinds of issues that the Cook County books were cooked. There's a lot of stuff that happened behind the scenes.
A bit like the Bush election in, was it 2000 or 2004? That was really, really rigged. They probably all are, but there was one in particular where they deliberately didn't count the votes in a certain county or whatever. But yeah, it was similar to that, and I think the Kennedy-Nixon election was the closest ever result, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think you said something like there was a 0.5 differential or something like that, very close.
Yeah,
49,
I think it was less than that actually, William. But yeah, it was along those lines. Yeah.
So Kennedy gets into the presidency, but he has a very colorful personal life, right?
Well, that's one way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing that people do know about Kennedy. I mean, he had lots of, shall we say, illicit liaisons with eligible young women. One of the quotes that I remember seeing when I was writing the book was that he'd bedded half the girls on the West Coast or something, half the eligible single girls on the West Coast, and probably a lot of the married ones as well. So yeah, it was a prolific adulterer, shall we say.
Right. He went to Stanford Business School or something like that, right? Didn't he attend Stanford for a little bit? Maybe that. Yeah, that's not part.
I can't remember. I know that he went to the boarding school he went to as a youth, as a teenager, was Choate, wasn't it?
Right,
yeah. But I don't know. I don't know whether he went to Stanford or not.
But there was an interesting aspect of him because of this kind of like he had a decadent, as a child of wealth, decadent life. But he was curious about stuff that was happening in the UK at the time of his presidency, something known as the Profumo affair. And you said he devoured every word about that, but he was tied into that affair. It's probably one of the main reasons why he was interested in it.
Yeah, it was tied into it. I think he asked all his aides and secretaries and etc. to keep him up to speed on it all the time. I mean, he was fascinated by it because I think he was actually running a little scared because it's known that he had an affair.
I'm sorry, you just dropped out right there.
Sorry.
Okay.
I think he wanted to be kept up to speed on the Profumo affair and how it was progressing. Because he'd been involved sexually with one of the women that was involved in the Profumo affair. Do you want to give a little bit of background to the Profumo affair?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, okay. Well, this was a big scandal in the UK in 1961, I think it was, where the Minister of War, Don Profumo, was involved in a scandal because he was having a love affair, sexual affair, with a woman who turned out to be a Russian spy and who had been also having an affair with some Russian diplomat in the UK, quite a high-ranking diplomat. But obviously the implications there were staggering. It was the height of the Cold War, and our Minister of War was, sleeping with a girl who was also having an affair with one of the major Russian diplomats. So it was a big thing in the UK, and I was only a small boy at the time.
It was
so
Christine Keeler was her name. Christine Keeler.
It was all over the newspapers and the TV and the radio and all that sort of stuff. But as it turned out, Kennedy had also been having an affair with the same woman. So I think he was pretty scared that he was going to get somehow dragged into it. And get his name dragged through the mud, and obviously that would have resulted in impeachment, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and that was Mariella Novotny, right? It was
Mariella Novotny, yeah.
So Mariella, and there was a movie about it here, or in the States, Scandal. I think it was done in.
That's right. Yeah. I think it was a British movie, wasn't it? But you probably got it over there too.
No, it was very interesting. An interesting story. Stephen Ward was the guy who was the kind of pimp of these young girls, and he was into black magic and. He was He was associating with all these other people in that society, the craze, and all this stuff like that. And I kind of covered that in my book. Talked about Tom Dryburgh and all these other kind of unsavory characters.
Yeah, well, Dryburgh was a communist, wasn't it? As it turned out, it was that's another story.
Yeah, another story. But he was very interesting. He was supposed to be Aleister Crowley's heir. That was supposed to be the guy who was going to carry on work, but he didn't seem to take to it. It was those '60s, and they were full of scandal in the UK. There was all kinds of scandals and things going on.
Yeah, indeed. So just to continue the story a little bit now. So obviously Kennedy's involved now, and not long after he took office, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course. No, before that, there was the Bay of Pigs fiasco, wasn't there?
Right.
And after that, that was an invasion of Cuba, for those who don't know, a planned invasion of Cuba, which Kennedy had sort of approved. But that was an utter disaster. They were all... Basically, they killed or captured on the beach by the Cubans, and that didn't go down too well with the American public. So Kennedy's popularity rating in the first year of his office was probably the worst in entire history of the US. It was so low. So he had to do certain things, Kennedy, to actually try and improve his popularity rating. And one of the things that sort of came afterwards was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, again, is a whole other story. But I believe that was entirely contrived with the connivance of Khrushchev in order to as far as Kennedy was concerned, to improve his popularity. And of course it did. And it went through the roof after the Cuban Missile Crisis because he was seen as the savior of mankind, basically. The world was on the brink of nuclear war, as we all thought, or as they all thought. And Kennedy was the 7th Cavalry riding over the hill, So he saved the day, and his popularity went through the roof.
Right, but the Bay of Pigs, I think the Bay of Pigs is key to the assassination because it involved his conflicts with the deep state at that time and led to the dismissal of the head of the CIA, John Dulles. Was it John Dulles or one of the Dulles brothers?
John Foster Dulles.
John Foster Dulles, who ended up being on the commission that oversaw the assassination. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Like, you look at those pictures, it's like, this is about as legit as a $3 bill. So, So, I mean, and Kennedy was no friend of the CIA. He made statements that I'm going to blow it up to smithereens, or so he was
split into the CIA into 1,000 pieces was his actual quote.
Yes, so
so him and the CIA were not best buddies.
Right, correct. So, but so you see this him just kind of making more and more enemies as his as his presidency, progressed.
Yeah, and of course, Bobby Kennedy, his brother, who was what was his position? He was
I think he was the
Attorney General, was it?
Attorney General, yes.
Yeah, and he was going after the mafia as well, of course, which didn't go down quite too well because it was all supposed to be one big cozy tea party, wasn't it? All these factions all sitting hand in hand, cozying up to each other, enjoying a great relationship. They weren't expecting that anybody in the US government was ever going to come down on them like they did. So that was the mafia. We've already covered the CIA. These are all factions that are getting their hands slapped by the new administration.
The oil industry.
There are murmurings about all this, and and then of course the next thing was another important thing to mention is the situation with LBJ as well, Johnson, because Kennedy and Johnson absolutely loathed and detested each other. They were the only reason that Kennedy had asked LBJ to be his running mate was that LBJ had a lot of influence in the Deep South and amongst the oil people, whereas Kennedy was very much an Eastern establishment kind of guy, wasn't he? And so he had a lot of sort of support on the Eastern Seaboard. But when you get down into the Deep South and especially the oil regions, Texas and other states, he wasn't popular at all. So he needed somebody like LBJ. I think if LBJ had not been on the ticket, I think Kennedy would have lost quite heavily, actually.
Interesting.
So LBJ and Kennedy hated each other, and he only tolerated him for the support that he would bring from other areas of the country that he knew that were his weakest positions. So, LBJ was as corrupt as they come as well.
Sure.
He was into all sorts of different things, and again, I don't cover all that in the book.
But he had a history of murder leading up to 1963, right? And had his, what was it, Mac Wallace was his hitman, killed his sister, like a really dark stuff.
That's right, absolutely, yeah. I do cover that in my book Behind the Curtain, actually. It's not in the JFK book, obviously it's a bit of a diversion, but yeah. So, these players are mounting up now. We've got the mafia, we've got the CIA, and as I was saying, LBJ was a big anti. I think LBJ was deeply involved in it as well. Excuse me. That's about. But the other side of the coin with LBJ was the fact that Kennedy upset all LBJ supporters in big oil. There was something called the oil depletion allowance that had been going on ever since the oil industry had been born in the late 19th century. And the oil depletion allowance basically said that it actually allowed you to offset a large amount of tax other than the normal standard business allowances. So So other industries weren't necessarily subject. I'd had this tax allowable element to their incomes, if you like, but it was just particularly for the oil industry, and nobody really knows why, other than probably lobbying. Right. But I think it was something like, it meant that you got a 30%. What's the word I'm looking for? 30% allowance, whereas most other industries was 25%, or it could have even been 20%. So it was a big difference anyway between all the different industries and oil. And Kennedy said, quite rightly, this is not right. We can't have one industry that is, benefiting in this way to the detriment of all the others. We'll scrap the oil depletion allowance. So that's what he did. In effect, what the oil depletion allowance meant to the oil industry was that they could go do some speculative drilling anywhere in the oil regions, and if 4 out of the 5 wells ended up being dry, then they still made a profit. Even with one well operating, they could still make a profit. But of course, without that allowance, then that wouldn't have been the case. Gotcha. So you can imagine the powerful big oil industry interests in Texas, of which LBJ was their de facto head, if you like. He was their sort of figurehead, were mightily upset by this. So again, we've got to tack those people onto the list of people who Kennedy had.
There's not a list of people he was making friends with, really. He was just kind of not making alliances that would support him. I think he alienated the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He fired a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, it was
and Hoover as well, who was intrinsically involved with the mafia, J. Edgar Hoover. Obviously, he was upset as well. So the FBI as well. That they were. You can add them to the list too. Right. Because Hoover was, like, as you pointed out, Hoover was in bed with the mafia, and the big crackdown from Bobby Kennedy on the mafia did not go down well with him, obviously, because it impacted on him and his lifestyle.
Right. Yeah. Cross-dressing, homosexuality.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
that's obviously going to go into
what was that guy?
Yes, now you mention it.
Yeah, his. I think his secretary was his lover, right? I forgot his name. But
I don't know.
At that time, it was very scandalous. But he, I think really you get into chapter 5 is really where you kind of talk about the ritual aspects, but also these global fronts where that all these people were associated, really, like Clay Shaw, who features in the Oliver Stone JFK movie, and the Garrison investigation was part of these kind of right-wing fascists, Centro Mondiale Commerciale, the Italian. So, and also, he had these weird CIA connections and was also an interesting character. So, it's just a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the Oliver Stone movie JFK was quite good as far as it went. I mean, it actually opened the door, if you like, to other investigations. But the movie itself was a bit of a letdown in many ways, because I think it was actually, it ended up actually being part of the cover-up, I think, and it wasn't as, shall we say, as enlightening as it could have been, and it focused on all these, as you pointed out, all these different elements that were involved. I mean, they, and again, but I think, as we've said before, they weren't the major players; they were just the foot soldiers in the operation. I think actually the key player was a guy called George de Mohrenschildt, who was descended from Russian aristocracy, and he was actually really weirdly, and nobody can understand why, or maybe they can. He was a friend of Oswald's, which was really strange, because Oswald was just an ordinary working guy, and yet this guy, this ex-Russian from a family of Russian aristocrats, he befriended Oswald for some reason, and he seemed to be his mentor. And there was all sorts of connections to Russia, if you remember, with Oswald. Yes. And again, some people believe, I'm not absolutely 100%, but some people believe that there were actually two Oswalds.
Yes.
One of them created by the CIA just to cause confusion. So that it sounds fantastic to say that the CIA actually created a lookalike, a double, if you like, and actually let him grow up totally independently of each other, these two Oswald's characters, just on the off chance that they might need him for something, some covert operation in the future. And this was one of the ones. Because there was another set of doubles. Well, because, again, what I cover it very briefly in the book, but what happened was that they were actually going to assassinate Kennedy in Chicago first off.
Right. There was a Miami operation too, right?
Yeah, that's right. But the I can't remember why, but the plan backfired, and so they had to call that off. I think word got out, didn't it? There was a possible assassination attempt. That was it. So the trip was cancelled or something. But apparently, so I believe, so I've read, there was another set of doubles that they were going to use in that particular plot had it come to that. So it must be a common occurrence, and they've got these two sets of, more than two sets of people probably all the time who are doubles, who they can use in the obfuscation after the event.
But the reason, one of the confirmations that there were doubles is that Oswald was in two places at the same time, right? Like he was seen in Mexico City and I think it was Louisiana at the same time. New Orleans, you're right. So he can't be at both places, but people are seeing him, and how do you resolve that?
Yeah, and even on the day, I mean, he was seen on the day of the assassination, he was seen in two different places at once. Because Oswald was supposed to have murdered the police officer, Tippit, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, but he was seen in another place in Dallas at the same time by different people, and of course, you then get because the whole thing is a complete lie and a complete fabrication.
Right.
You get all these anomalies of people seeing different elements of it in different ways, and of course, then that needs a bit of a cleanup operation.
Right.
So then you get, you get what's called. Some people may have heard of the Clinton body count. Well, this is the Kennedy body count because there were literally hundreds of people who were actually died in very, very suspicious circumstances in the years following the assassination, all who were sort of vaguely, peripherally involved in many different aspects of that day.
Right, like de Mohrenschildt himself, supposedly,
Indeed.
Supposedly
yeah, I mean, he died very suddenly the day he was supposed to appear at one of the hearings, didn't he?
Right,
I mean,
that's actually very common in D.C. If you're supposed to attend a hearing, your likelihood of dying mysteriously 48 hours ahead is very high. So it's not just de Mohrenschildt. But if you read, Family of Secrets, I can't remember the name of the author, but there's papers between de Mohrenschildt talking to George Bush Sr., and de Mohrenschildt's basically pleading for his life. And
really?
He's clearly saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. No, this is not verbatim. But it's doing it in a very, in something of an educated person of those. He was a white Russian. He was part of the group that resisted the Soviets, and his family was basically destroyed and kicked out. But also an oil man. But yeah, he was. I mean, there are papers there that do exist of talking between him and George Bush Sr., who was at an oil meeting supposedly on the day of the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just to go back to all these different factions that JFK upset for me, I mean, there was all the ones that we've already mentioned, Big Oil, LBJ, the Mafia, the CIA, the FBI. But importantly, I think it's worth mentioning financial empire as well.
Sure.
Was it 63 years just before he was killed, wasn't it? He issued Executive Order 11110, which was effectively bypassing the Federal Reserve and their ability to create money from thin air and charge interest on it. He thought that was a bad idea, which of course it is, but of course the Federal Reserve and their power through the Crown Empire is all-encompassing, really, and they were not going to sit back and let Kennedy issue his own currency. That would have been the end of their gravy train. So again, we can add them to the list. That big finance were a major player in all this, and the things all coming together now. And of course, the Bushes as well. You mentioned very briefly George H.W. Bush there, and they had their hearts set on being a presidential dynasty as well. So they got all sorts of vaulting ambitions along those lines. Right. So, and Bush was, well, we all know what kind of a guy Bush was, I think. So we can add him to the list, and the Bush family itself, not just H.W., but his father Prescott as well. I think they were all, they were all involved too.
It's just remarkable too. The Kennedy dynasty was basically destroyed over time. So when JFK, Robert, then the JFK Jr. was killed.
Yeah, well, Edward as well. I mean, Edward was disgraced with Chappaquiddick, wasn't he? I mean, that was probably of his own making, I guess. But
true.
But he would, he would. I think he was. Was he standing for election?
Yes.
The following year.
Yeah, he was trying to become president. He was trying to follow in the line.
Yeah. So of course, that's, as you say, the John and Bobby, and then the younger brother Edward. Edward, after the Chappaquiddick incident, then Edward never stood a chance of becoming president because of the sting that it created, basically.
Yeah, and JFK was it Robert RFK said that he was going to get to the bottom of his brother's assassination, and that
he did.
Then he had to go. Yeah. So.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course, he was probably getting too close to the truth.
Yeah, it's just insane. So, I mean, I think that what's really interesting about the book is you tie this kind of crown power through, Perm Index, these known talks, the New Orleans trade mart that were covered in JFK's movie, and the Garrison investigation. All these things. This guy William Stevenson, who is in Jamaica, that you think assembled the groups. And
of course, Stevenson was MI6 as well, which is the British Foreign Intelligence Service. So again, that's another sort of proof, if you like, that it wasn't just an internal deal. It was the British Crown, and MI6 is an integral part of the British Crown. It's their security service, in effect. Right. So Stevenson was a big player in it, absolutely.
And what is it? Ian Fleming wrote the guidelines for the founding of the CIA from the OSS. Like Fleming actually traveled to the U.S. to write the paper to set up the CIA. Have you ever heard that?
No, I didn't. That's interesting.
No. Yeah. So, and he's friends with Stevenson in Jamaica, the Trial Club, and you and I talked about Le Cirque offline. So there's all these clubs of very patriotic, pseudo-fascist or real fascist people. All involved in this death, the death of JFK.
Absolutely, yeah. But just to sort of round off about the book itself, I mean, as I say, the details of the actual assassination and all the aftermath, it's probably pretty standard stuff. I mean, I will be the first to admit that, although, it's my take on it, obviously, but I don't think there's possibly any vastly new information within that aspect of it. But as you say, the whole premise of the book is how it wasn't just an internal operation. It was probably a worldwide thing, especially with the British influence. And I think that's what makes the book different and stand out from the crowd, if you like, in my humble opinion,
That's great. Well, I definitely recommend the book. Is there anything that we're at 45 minutes? Is there anything you'd like to add, or other than that,
I can't really think of anything, William, to be honest.
All right.
I think we've covered the basics of it. I mean, we could go into masses of detail, but I think,
that's what the book is for. People, go get the book. JFK, A Very British Coup. John Hamer, another great book of his that I read is The Falsification of History, Our Distorted Reality. I haven't read John's books about the banking cartel. I don't know if I could actually go through without, getting too depressed about the whole banking system. I don't know if I can read those, but anyway, this is a great book.
I think you would enjoy it though, William.
I think I would.
As I say to people, it's not just about the banking cartel itself, because people have said to me in the past, "Oh no, I'm not interested in money and banking. Oh, no, it bores me to death. No, I couldn't read a 6-inch thick book about that." But the point about the book is, and it's probably not very well explained in the blurb on the book, the cover info. It's really about how the banking cartel. First of all, it goes into details about how it came about and the history of banking and money. But I don't I only generalize. I don't spend too much time on that. And then I go into the banking families and all the families, all the sort of bloodline families who run the world. And really, what the book is about is how the banking industry has been their foundation stone, has been the platform that they've used to control the rest of the world, and what they've actually done to the rest of the world. So it's not just about banking. It's like, if you like, it's like an expansion on the falsification of history. Falsification of history is more or less a series of chapters knitted together. You could read those chapters in any order, and it wouldn't make a particular difference. But BTC, Budget Behind the Curtain, covers the whole thing from start to finish, and its foundation stone is the banking system. But that it's only that gives people the money and the power to be able to do what they've done to the world for the last few centuries.
And that's kind of the way it is. When these families make money, the first thing they do is go start a bank. So, they make oil money, start a bank. Rockefeller start Chase, Mellon Bank, all these people. That's really augments and expands their power. It's really true.
That's right. It's the money that gives them the power at the end of the day, and that's really what, as I say, that's what the book's about. So.
Gotcha. All right, cool. JFK, A Very British Coup, John Hamer, Hamer. Check it out. Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you, William.
Okay.